Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Margaret Holmes. I am the director of Van Cortlandt House Museum. Before we begin, I just want to mention that Van Cortlandt House Museum has another free up a week from today on Thursday, September 25th. A conversation about slavery in the Hudson Valley. Two linked descendants share their stories with Deborah Bruno and Eleanor C. Meyer. Tracing their journey of genealogical discovery and based on Deborah's new book, A Hudson Valley Reckoning, Discovering the Forgotten History of Slaveholding in My Dutch American Family. You can register for that on the VCHM website or from the link in our Instagram bio. Tonight's presentation 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open up a Q&A session for anything you'd like to ask Genevieve. I'm going to ask you to please type your questions into the Q&A box in the bar that's in the bottom of the Zoom, and then we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible live. So tonight we welcome Genevieve Wheeler Brown discussing her new book, Beyond Blue and White, The Hidden History of Delftware and the Women Behind the Iconic Ceramic. Now, Genevieve and I are coming to you this evening from the West Parlor of Van Cortlandt House Museum with the backdrop of our Delft tiles and the blue and orange palette of the original Dutch flag. We hope that you enjoy this beautiful room as much as we do as Genevieve discusses the Van Cortlandt House Delft collection. And a little bit about Genevieve. She is a decorative art advisor and writer with over 30 years in the art world, including a decade with Christie's in New York and London. She's been actively involved in the community of Delftware, and she's also participated on the Antiques Roadshow as an appraiser with an eye for overlooked treasure. So without further ado, I bring you Genevieve Wheeler Brown.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, thank you. And what a treat here, literally in the Van Cortlandt House Museum. And in writing Beyond Blue and White, my research has taken me everywhere from Amsterdam and Delft to here in Manhattan, but also right here in the Bronx. So, and as you will learn, this place, this fieldstone house, its collection and its land beneath it, actually all play important roles as told in Beyond Blue and White. Tonight's journey was inspired by actually something small, a long forgotten blue and white jug tucked away on a shelf in Manhattan, in a Manhattan townhouse just down the Hudson River. Now, that single object opened a door into a much larger story, an exploration that uncovered not just the history of Dutch Delftware, but the hidden histories of women whose influence has been overlooked and yet has always been there, just waiting to be rediscovered. So join me, let's go. So I spent over 30 years as a writer and an art advisor in the decorative arts, but my story starts much earlier when I was growing up in Washington, D.C. And most people think of D.C. as a place of politics, but for me, it was really also a city of art. And one of my favorite childhood hideouts, well, that was the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery, where I fell for Whistler's Peacock Room from 1876. Now picture it, it's surfaces of deep blue and green walls with gold, and it's myriads of shelves, all lined with ceramics, painting, architecture, pottery, porcelain, all in conversation. Now that early fascination led me into the decorative arts. It's the kind of history that you can literally hold in your hands. Later at Christie's in London and in New York, I handled everything from Stradivari violins to Fabergé eggs, and yes, sometimes even fakes. So now let's fast forward to the summer of 2019, and I get a call from the chair of the art, a women's organization founded during the Gilded Age in New York. It's the National Society of Colonial Dames. Now, she invited me to come take a look at a very small part of their collection at the headquarters, a private townhouse in New York's Upper East Side. Now, I'll admit, I thought that I was just there to see a handful of objects, but when I walked, what greeted me was astonishing. It was a rare cache of more than 75 pieces of 17th and 18th century Dutch Delftware. Now, but before we get too far down our blue and white path, though, let's pause for a moment, because I should probably answer the question that some of you may be thinking. What exactly is Dutch Delftware? And if I say the term, maybe you picture a small square Dutch tile, like the ones right behind me, surrounding me, here in the West Parlor. Here's one with a landscape. And here's one of children wearing skates. Or maybe you think of a plate with flowers and birds. Here's another. Or maybe you think of one of those iconic vases, sometimes called tulip vases. Basically, you probably know Delftware, even though you're not sure about Delftware. But you know, Delftware is also so much more. So basically, there are three main types of ceramics in the world. There is porcelain, there is stoneware, and there is earthenware. Now, earthenware is the oldest, and it's probably developed over 20,000 years ago. Buff or reddish clay, soft, porous, definitely not watertight. Delftware is tin glazed earthenware, which is to say, well, earthenware dressed up. And the technique of tin glazed earthenware, old one, probably as early as the 9th century AD. And it probably came to Europe from the Middle East via Spain as a result of conquest, trade, and exchange. Now, imagine taking humble clay and dunking it in opaque white glaze, a kind of ceramic concealer. Now, suddenly, that prized material perfected by the Chinese by the 8th century, celebrated for its seemingly magical and naturally luminous white clay. And onto this bright ground, painters added decoration to tin glazed earthenware. Most famously, they used cobalt, which during firing transformed from a dull gray slip into that unmistakable, vibrant blue. So voila, here we have Delftware, porcelain's cousin, so to speak, and it's named after Delft, of course, the small Dutch city in which it was made from about 1620 to through the mid-19th century. But to understand why Delftware mattered, we need to set the scene. 17th century Holland, the Dutch Golden Age. Think Vermeer, Rembrandt, Judith Leister, Rachel Ruysch, too. A small nation at the height of its powers. It was an economic powerhouse. It was rich in trade and bursting with art. And at the center of this wealth, that's the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, which maintained a network of linked trading posts across Asia. And they brought back silks, spices, lacquer, exotic animals, but the real prize was the porcelain. Chinese porcelain was called white gold, and for a good reason, and Europe could not get enough. But then came a twist. In the mid-1600s, war and turmoil in China cut off porcelain exports. Suddenly, the market dried up, declining from 250,000 pieces a year to mere trickle. Now, cue the Delft potters. Hey, we could do this, they thought, and they rolled up their sleeves and used a combination of local and imported clays to, and with some clever tin glaze trickery, they started imitating Chinese porcelain to fill that void. Now, at a glance, it can sometimes be nearly impossible to tell them apart. So here's a fun challenge for you. One of these is Chinese porcelain, and the other Delft, both from around the 1600s. Now, can you tell the difference? Not so easy, right? If you held them in their hands, though, the differences would start to show. Delft tends to feel just a little bit thicker, and flip it over, and on the back, you'd see spots of areas where that buff-colored clay starts to peek through, especially as from the firing or along the base edges. And run your fingers across the surface, and you'll start to notice small pinholes too, where the glaze sank into the porous earthenware. So before long, Delftware was everywhere. From everyday dishes to luxurious garnitures, no Dutch home was complete without it. And engravings and paintings from the time showed Delftware on cabinets, across cornices, along mantelpieces. It was marketed as Dutch porcelain, and it worked. And at first, Delft found its audience by imitating Asian porcelain. But it didn't take long before it grew into an art form in its own right. Remarkably creative, endlessly innovative, and ultimately an international symbol of Dutch artistry. Delft became its own global brand. Now, back to 2019 and that Manhattan townhouse. Now, in a sea of dozens of pieces of Delftware, one piece stood out to me. Now, at first glance, it looked like a simple blue and white Delft picture. But then I noticed its rim. It was sprouting spouts. Now, its neck practically dared me to try drinking from it. This was no pitcher. This was a puzzle jug. Now, puzzle jugs were the life of the European 17th and 18th, and they were part drinking vessel, part practical joke, and really part engineering marvel. They were logic puzzles disguised as pottery. The trick? Well, hidden channels in the handle and secret holes. Cover the right ones and the right order, and you got your wine. Well, if you missed one, you wore it. And can you imagine the laughter around the table in 18th century Holland? And let's be honest, a lot of Dutch linen napkins were probably sacrificed playing this game. So I lifted the puzzle jug. I turned it over, and there it was, 3 initials used in cobalt, G, V, S. Now, after going to the reference books, I discovered something I was not expecting. Her name was Gertrude Verstella, a woman, a pottery owner, a story. These 3 letters had stopped me in my tracks. They cracked open centuries of forgotten history. Who was she? And how many other women were hiding in Delftware's story? Now, the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Women weren't footnotes in Delftware. They were actually everywhere. Research shows that 1 in 5 of all names of registered owners of Delftware potteries from the 17th century through the early 19th were female. That's 1 in 5. Some inherited businesses as widows. Clearly, they were often the business partners with their husbands, but others like Barbara Rodeville, who founded her own pottery in 1671, were entrepreneurs from the start. So how were Dutch women in the 17th and 18th century able to achieve this? Well, the success of women in the Delftware industry, as well as other businesses of the Dutch Republic, was really no accident. It rested on a rare mix of legal rights, of education, and often necessity. Dutch women could inherit equally with their brothers. And in 1654, the Guild of St. Luke allowed women to keep running their husbands' workshops for life without having to take the required master's test. And add to that widespread education. Dutch girls learned reading, writing, arithmetic, but also business skills. They had financial literacy, and all of this strengthened their independence. Now, Benjamin Franklin admired the Dutch system, and in 1786, crediting it for Elizabeth Timothy, that's America's first female newspaper editor's success, urging that American women too be trained in what he thought were useful skills like bookkeeping and accounting to guard against widowhood and what Franklin called crafty men. So by 1650, 70% of Amsterdam's bridegrooms and half of the brides could sign their names. Now that's well above Europe's average for men and women, which was only 35 to 40%. Now, of course, not everybody loved this. Dutch women faced mixed messages, like women today. Jacob Cott's 1625 bestseller Huwelijk or Marriage was the most widely read book in the Dutch Republic after the Bible. It warned against women running businesses, but reality said otherwise. Now, looking at population records, Delft had actually more women than men, since so many men were at sea or abroad with the Dutch East India Company. Investors, the Dutch East India Company was lucrative, but for sailors and its accompanying soldiers, it was deadly. Voyages were so dangerous they earned the grim nickname the Indianeschlecht, the Indian leak. Even if they survived storms and pirates, disease claimed thousands more. The numbers are actually stark. Between 1700 and 1794, of the 8,000 sailors who left Delft, only 5,000 returned. For the ship's accompanying soldiers, just 600 out of more than 2,000 survived. So what did this mean for Delft? Well, it meant that women's self-sufficiency was not a choice, it was often a necessity. And they didn't just keep those potteries alive, they grew them. Now, imagine the Delft potteries these women owned and oversaw. Behind those brick facades, each pottery could produce up to an estimated 200,000 pieces a year by the 30 to 60 workers, each with a specialty, including rowers bringing up and vases on their givers who were dipping the fire dishes and bowls into those vats of glaze, stokers feeding the kilns, painters brushing their cobalt designs. Now, were there female Delftware painters too? Well, if they could paint oil on canvas, why not on pottery? But the truth is, without signatures, and Delftware wasn't usually signed by the painters, we just don't know yet, but I like to think so. The history of women's stewardship of Delftware doesn't end with the owners of these potteries. There were also the patrons, like Delftware's biggest fan, II, who reigned over England from 1689 to 1694 as co-monarch, together with William III. Now, married off to her first cousin, William of Orange, at the age of 15, Mary moved to Holland and fell in love, not just with her husband's country, but with its ceramics. Now, when she became queen, she took Delftware with her back to England. Her most spectacular project, the Water Gallery at Hampton Court Palace. Imagine on the Thames turned into a jewel box retreat. Mary hired the leading designers and artisans of her age, including Sir Christopher Wren, Daniel Moreau, Grinling Gibbons. Blue and white everywhere, upholstery, furnishings, tiles, sconces, and of course, quantities of Delftware made just for her by the Greek A pottery, towering giant blue and white ewers. Delft tulip vases standing nearly 5 feet tall for cascading blooms. Monumental tiles. In a world where standard tiles were about the size of your hand, Mary's were almost 2 feet across. They were canvases in earthenware that pushed the boundaries of Dutch tile making. She even built a pleasure dairy where her maids served milk and cream in dishes. Marie, really eat your heart out. No images or plans of the water gallery survive. It was dismantled and the building destroyed by William after Mary's sudden death from smallpox in 1994 at the age of just 32. Now, but we can still imagine it through the few pieces of her Delftware that remain, objects that once filled that dazzling blue and white retreat. Well, having a little fun with AI, written descriptions, and the inventories from the period. Did the pleasure dairy at Hampton Court Palace possibly look like this? Ah, there we go. We don't know. But following Mary's death in the 18th century, Delftware continued to uphold its place as a symbol of style. But the ceramic world in the 18th century was rapidly changing. Delft potters now face fierce new competition. First came Meissen in Germany in the early 1700s, producing the first true European porcelain with white translucent high-fired clay. And then there was Sèvres, of course, in France with its dazzling colors. And perhaps most significantly, the challenge from England with coal-fired kilns, producing inexpensive mass-marketed ceramics called creamware that flooded Europe with affordable alternatives to Delftware. Now, to survive, Delft potters had to adapt. They refined their shapes, they adopted new palettes, and they mirrored fashionable tastes. Here is an example that came from the workshop of Gertrude Verstella, a kettle creatively a la mode, unmistakably aware of the competition Sèvres on the left. Now, as European porcelain rose in prominence, Delftware endured, changing shape, changing style, yet always maintaining its blue and white allure. But by the early 19th century, the tides had changed. The Dutch Golden Age had ended, and the Dutch East India Company, bloated by corruption, crushed by costs, and dissolved in 1799. The Guild of St. Luke, long the city's artistic backbone, disbanded, 1833. Even Dutch iconic gates, immortalized in Vermeer's view of Delft, were dismantled, sold for building materials. Now, by 1835, only 5 of the once more than 30 Delft potteries remained. But a declining economy and that fierce global competition nearly impossible. By the 1860s, just one pottery remains, the porcelain flies or the porcelain bottle, today known as Royal Delft. And so, in just over 2 centuries, Delft was fading in spirit. But just when Delft seemed lost to history, blue and white ceramics roared back into fashion. And in the 1870s, Britain and America were swept up in what the press gleefully called China mania. And at that point, the word China meant also a lot more than just porcelain from Asia. China was a catch-all term, stretching from European tin-glazed earthenware to the most coveted imports from the East. What really mattered wasn't the geography, it was the craze for collecting anything blue and white. Now, this craze was fueled by the aesthetic movement, a reaction against the mass consumerism of the Industrial Revolution. Now, disillusioned with inexpensive, repetitive goods, a new generation of artists and intellectuals, among them Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the American expatriate James McNeill Whistler, championed a philosophy of art for art's sake. Beauty, they argued, should permeate everyday life. And beauty, in their eyes, came in the form of blue and white. Fashionable men and women began filling their homes with Chinese porcelain, Japanese bowls, Iznik dishes, Dutch tiles, and of course, what they now called, quote, Old Delft. Now, for them, these pieces were not necessities, but they were declarations, objects that signaled taste, worldliness, refinement. Whistler, too, wove this aesthetic throughout his art, featuring blue and white porcelain prominently in his paintings. And in doing so, he helped cement ceramic's place at the very center of fashionable interiors. So even as Delft's kilns went cold and the world's obsession with blue and white endured, reignited, reinvented, and carried forward by a new generation of collectors, dreamers, and tastemakers. Now, with Delft's pottery silent and the appetite for old blue and white growing exponentially by the day, a thriving market for fakes and forgeries quickly emerged, unscrupulous dealers passing off newly made counterfeits as antiques, or added false marks from well-known potteries to unmarked pieces, instantly inflating their value. Now, one of the most prolific imitators was the French firm of Samson ici, and on the left is an original Delft plate. And on the right, a Samson painter's watercolor cheat sheet. So this was their guide as they painted a copy. Now, through though Samson marked their pieces with an S, those marks could be scraped away, blurring the line between copy and original. For collectors, the market became a minefield, sparking a boom in best-selling guide to help tell the fakes from the real thing. And many of those guides, yes, written by women. Jenny Young, a young New Yorker, published her encyclopedic The Ceramic Art in 1875, a work so popular it received full-page coverage in the New York Times. Another, Alice Morse Earle, who lived in Brooklyn and for over 14 years produced 17 bestsellers on subjects ranging from ceramics to colonial history. She wrote more than 47 magazine articles on everything from furniture to Delftware. These women, along with others, became powerful voices in shaping public taste. They not only fed a voracious appetite for collecting, they helped train a new generation, often women themselves, to become their own ceramic experts. So meanwhile, across America, American women were embarking on their own ceramic chases. Now, beginning shortly after the Civil War, the collecting of blue and white ceramics became a national passion. In 1878, William Cowper Prime, who was the author of Pottery and Porcelain of All Times in All Nations, described the meteoric rise of American enthusiasm in blue and white. He says, 10 years ago, there were probably not 10 collectors of pottery and porcelain in the United States. Today, there are perhaps 10,000. Now, Prime's enthusiast was his wife, Mary Trumbull Prime, who traveled through Europe, Africa, Asia to build an encyclopedic collection, from Greek calyxes to Dutch Delftware. And in 1875, she loaned it to the newly founded Metropolitan Museum of Art. But rather than just buying from New York dealers, Mary, like many women of her era, including her sister, the author Annie Trumbull Slosson, also chose a more adventurous path, one that demanded time, planning, and stamina, and it was called China. Now, China hunting began in the United States shortly after the Civil War as well, in the 1860s. It was centered largely in New England and the mid-Atlantic areas, where collectors went directly into households to purchase ceramics, cutting out dealers and stepping into the adventure themselves. China hunters would often arrive by train, then hire carriages to set off across rural landscapes and seaside villages. Now picture them. They're rumbling down dusty lanes. They're past weathered farmhouses or venturing into thick forests, knocking on doors, peeking through windows inquiring about family heirlooms tucked away on kitchen shelves. Now, they were armed with new pocket-sized guides like Fanny Bury Palliser's bestseller of 1876, The China Collector's Pocket Companion. A woman could check pottery marks on the spot before making the deal. And of course, China hunting could be both lengthy and costly, but its appeal was importantly but it allowed collectors to bypass dealers, avoid inflated prices, and most importantly, sidestep that growing flood of fakes and forgeries. As one 1909 article in the Boston Cooking magazine advised, it is cheaper to buy from country homes than from town shops, and one feels more certain that her old blue is genuine. Yet for many American women, the draw was more than authenticity. It was often the thrill of the chase. It was an opportunity for adventure. Now, the most common discoveries were bright blue English Staffordshire, probably, of the 19th century, but on occasion, collectors uncovered older treasures, 17th and 18th century Chinese porcelain, or even authentic Dutch Delftware itself, often the last surviving fragments of family collections handed down in former English and Dutch territories. And here you can see the result, a late 19th century China hunter's trophy room. Now, these women, China hunting was never just about the objects. It was about discovery, it was about community, and it was about the sheer acceleration of the chase. Now, at the very moment when women across the country were pursuing this old blue, and if truly lucky, finding that piece of old Delft, a very different adventure was unfolding and taking shape in New York City. Now, in the 1890s, a group of women was ready to take the collecting to the next level. And they would not only gather objects, they would share them with the world. Now, on March 2nd of 1897, Alice Claypole Vanderbilt, that's Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, opened the doors of her chateau-like home at 1 West 57th Street in New York to more than 200 female guests. Her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, future founder of the Whitney Museum, was at her side. Now, Alice was no ordinary hostess, self-made queen of New York society. Alice was a fearless leader who had raised the art of opulent living to dazzling heights during America's Gilded Age. Her mansion, an entire New York City block, today including the site of Bergdorf Goodman, you can see in this photo, was encircled by a towering wrought iron fence containing over 130 rooms. Imagine it, Louis XV, Louis XVI style salons, a dining room glittering with masterpieces, Moorish smoking room, and a gilded ballroom that could hold literally hundreds. Now, it was in this very ballroom that Alice and her fellow members of one of New York's newest female organizations gathered, the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New York. Now, that day, the ladies enjoyed tea, a lecture, and an exhibition of rare silver, furniture, and of course, blue and white ceramics. Now, Alice's guest list was truly remarkable. Society, yes, but also women deeply engaged in the shaping of New York's cultural life. Many were tied closely to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan. Together, these women formed a powerful, if often overlooked network. But make no mistake, this gathering was not just social. These women were plotting something unprecedented: to found their own museum. Now, at a time when women were excluded from voting and from boards of major cultural institutions, including the Met, their museum would be an institution conceived, financed, curated, and run entirely by women. Now, the site chosen by these women for their museum is where I'm with you tonight. It is a location truly rich with history. Once home to the Native American Wequesque people, it was acquired by the Dutch West India Company in 1639, and soon after, Adrian van der Donck, the Leiden-educated lawyer and often nemesis of Peter Stuyvesant, purchased this land. A century later, in 1748, Jacobus van Cortlandt's descendants built this house with enslaved labor, but still stands. And it would host guests in the 18th century from George Washington to the future King William IV of England. Now, by the 1890s, though, the house had fallen into disrepair. It was sold to the city, and it was used by the Engineer Corps and even the National Guard as a changing area for the cavalry. Now, that's when the colonial dames stepped in. Now, they were clearing brush, they were repairing rooms, including the Dutch tile surrounds just behind me of the fireplace, and gathering historic objects. Not just to restore a mansion, it was to create a public museum. So on May 27 of 1897, before a crowd of over 1,200 people that included New York's mayor, Van Cortlandt House Museum opened its Dutch doors. And just days earlier, the Hewitt sisters inaugurated their Cooper Union Museum of Arts of Decoration, today's Cooper Hewitt. Together, these museums marked a turning point. They were America's first female-led museums. Now, the New York Times celebrated the opening of the Van Cortlandt House Museum and declared, although it is the smallest free museum in the city, it is by far one of the most interesting. Now, inside wooden and glass display cases, visitors saw relics like Aaron Burr's pistols, a piece of Martha Washington's wedding dress, and Peter Stuyvesant's snuff box. Yet, the greatest artifact of all was perhaps the house itself. The women named the museum not for themselves, but for the family of Dutch descent who built it. And over the next 75 years, they developed a permanent collection of American and European fine and decorative arts, one that came to include one of the finest Delftware holdings in the country at the time, highlighted by a puzzle jug inscribed with the initials of Gertrude Verstella. And the public responded. From the opening day, New Yorkers poured in. Some came by train, others by the newly fashionable bicycle. And in the summer of 1897, as many as 5,000 visitors arrived daily. So by 1903, the dames proudly declared their hopes had been fulfilled. They had created a public museum, small, yes, but in their words, a place of education and relaxation for the public, as the Metropolitan Museum or the Museum of Natural History. In 1903, the Van Cortlandt House Museum gained a new attraction, the Dutch Garden. Now spread across 5 acres, it was anything but modest. Gravel paths, a system of canals, and parterres radiating from a central fountain evoking Het Loo in Holland, the Dutch Versailles created by Queen Mary II. Now picture it, each spring, more than 100,000 tulips bloomed. The design came from the city of Samuel Parsons Jr., but it was the persistence of women, including Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan, the author Alice Morse Earle, and one of the most influential of the early 20th century and founding member of the Garden Club of America, Helena Rutherford Ely, that brought it to life. Now for them, the garden was as much a cultural as botanical. It was a tribute to New York's Dutch roots. Now, at the same time, America swept up in yet another craze, and this time one that historians now call Holland mania. Now, from the 80s to the 1920s, Dutch influence touched popular culture, advertising, architecture, collecting. Companies marketed things like Old Dutch cleanser, and Dutch boy paints. Now, the Dutch colonial revival architecture appeared nationwide, and once forgotten painters like Vermeer became prizes of Gilded Age collections. Now, New York was especially caught up in the Holland mania with the Hudson. Now, the Van Cortlandt House Museum was a popular part of the festivities, with more than 300,000 visitors coming up to the Bronx to see the museum in the summer of 1909. Now, but this Dutch fascination went far beyond fashion, ceramics, and history. It was a moment of massive immigration. Americans were digging into identity. In 1903, as tulips dazzled in Van Cortlandt Park, the Ladies' Home Journal editor, Edward Bok, that not England, but the Netherlands was, in his words, quote, the mother of America. So the decades flew by since the women's founding of the Van Cortlandt House Museum in 1897. And by 1965, the women had transformed what began in the 1890s as a selection of loaned objects into a carefully curated permanent collection. And their efforts to produce something extraordinary. They did, and they did it. More than 75 pieces of Dutch Delftware, so significant that it demanded its own gallery. The former dining room here in the house was refitted and renamed the exhibition room, extensively devoted to this ceramic treasure. Now, since the house had opened its Dutch door to the public in 1897, 1 million visitors had come by 1965. Now, for many, it was their very first encounter with Dutch Delftware. For others, ceramic lovers, collectors, editors, the Van Cortlandt House Museum was a destination, and visitors included none other than Dr. David Rohl, the former director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Now, so what did you see when you entered the Van Cortlandt House Museum's exhibition room? Few photographs survive, but records tell us the display filled at least 7 bronze-mounted glass cabinets. The range of Delft was dazzling, from 17th century Chinese or crack style to the 18th century Rococo-inspired forms. There was Delft literally in every form imaginable. There were familiar objects, the plates, the bowls, the lidded vases, the teapots. And then there were unfamiliar ones, pieces made for customs long since vanished. Pipe stands designed to cradle long-stemmed Dutch clay pipes. Or barber bowls with their scalloped rim cut away to fit snug against a gentleman's neck. Some pieces were functional, like a butter dishes, and salt cellars, and others were purely sculptural, whimsical, symbolic. One cabinet held a laughing Buddha, or the Buddha Hersang, the plump belly and wide grin. But in this Dutch version, you'll see he cradles not prayer beads, but a long Dutch pipe and a cup of tea. Another case featured a figure of a woman, a Dutch woman in a hat and petticoat, hands planted firmly on her hips. She's only 6 inches tall, yet her stance is commanding and her gaze direct, a tiny sculpture, remarkable authority for the marks of Delft's finest potters. From the White Star came a butter tub depicting a boy in a blue coat, delighting his pet yellow bird. From the Greek A, under the leadership of Johanna van der Hol, I might add, a beautiful Imari style dish. Unsigned pieces too revealed exquisite craftsmanship. A pair of gilt Delftware bird cages made around 1730 stood out as marvels of art. These delicate cages reflected the Dutch Republic's global reach. Now, alongside those spices, silks, and lacquer porcelain, the Dutch East India Company carried exotic birds back from Asia. These were parakeets, parrots. They were prized both princes and merchants. And these Delftware bird cages are rectangular. They have working doors, they had food drawers, and little metal bars. Now, could these have ever actually housed real birds? Almost certainly not. These were demonstrations of really pure virtuosity, pushing limits of clay to do what earthenware should really not be able to do. And the exhibition room was not just about form, it was about color, a kaleidoscope of shades, not just blue and white. Now, this collection was not the Rijksmuseum, of course, glitter with royal provenance, but it carried really something else, a history built over decades, shaped by the commitment and the collaboration of women who preserved, curated, and gave Delftware a home in the Bronx, ensuring that it would not be lost, but instead remain a living witness to history. Now then, in the 1960s, the women of the Van Cortlandt House Museum found themselves at a crossroads. On one hand, the city was celebrating. Lincoln Center was going up. The World's Fair was dazzling visitors in Queens. But underneath that energy, New York was facing real financial troubles. Funding for parks and cultural institutions was shrinking, and the Van Cortlandt Park felt it. The museum, right in the heart of the park, was left exposed, and the Delftware collection suddenly felt vulnerable. In the 1960s and 1965, the women made a difficult decision. It was a tough call to move the pieces, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way to be sure that these fragile treasures would survive. And the Delftware's destination, the Colonial Dames headquarters on East 71st Street, through a Dutch black door, up a grand staircase, and into a bright gallery. The Delftware emerged again, high above the Manhattan streets, but ready for its next. Now tonight, you've met only just of the many women whose lives are bound to Delftware. Pottery owners, patrons, collectors, historians, museum founders. They may have been called a weaker vessel in their time, but in truth, they were anything but. They were ambitious, resilient, resourceful. So the next time you spot a piece of Delftware, whether it's in a museum, or better yet, if you make it up here to the Bronx, to the Van Cortlandt House Museum in the future, I hope, or even the Colonial Dames headquarters in Manhattan, I hope you see it a little differently. I hope you see that Delft is not only a beautiful art, but it's a vessel for women's stories. It's a tangible link to centuries of hidden ingenuity and ambition. A single shard of pottery, or even a small puzzle jug, can open an entire world when we choose to look beyond blue and white. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. That was amazing.
Bear with me 1 second. This was so much fun to be. I so enjoyed this.
Well, I think what we're going to do is we're going to take some Q&A from folks in the audience.
Fantastic.
So I will read those to you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I really can't believe I'm here as the sun is setting in the Bronx. I mean, this is stunning. I wish everyone could see the light setting through these windows.
I'm going to leave it here.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you questions.
Oh, okay. Very good.
So, is there any blue and white Delftware displayed at the Van Cortlandt House today?
Absolutely. If I could, well, in addition to of course, the Dutch tiles, There are a number, I am looking at this very moment, there are a few pieces, yes. There are some beautiful tobacco jars that are just to my right that are here, 18th century, that are lovely. Again, amazing examples reflecting, you know, the Dutch East India Company's wide reach, and examples of Delftware that was made for some of their exports. I know upstairs also there's a beautiful, the original Dutch room that was created to really display Dutch decorative arts is fantastic. It has some, which also really beautiful, and there are books written just about this subject in Delftware. It's called White Delftware. So it's really, it was unpainted, just white. There's a beautiful lobed white Delftware dish upstairs. And I think, yeah, there are a few. But the Van Cortlandt, the Delftware that was formerly in this museum can also be seen at the headquarters of the National Society of Colonial Dames, and is open for private appointments. So please call the Dames, and we're it is absolutely there for, you know, for you to see and enjoy.
Okay, is there any document, you can repeat the question as well?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I'll repeat the questions. Exactly, sorry.
Is there any documentation of women being trained as Delftware painters or throwers, or did women come to the profession through their family?
No, that's a great question. Are there, what was the role, were women trained ever in as painters or potters themselves? And you know, it just seems that in a culture where women were members of guilds as painters, as on oil on canvas, that it would be most likely that women were involved. But the difficulty with Delftware is that the painters, the Delftware was rarely, if ever, signed by the painter. So we're really lacking that. What we do have is that all the owners, it was a regulated business in that the owners were all registered. So we know the owners, but we really don't know the identities of a lot of the painters. But that being said, you know, the archives are there, and I think it's just in time that we'll learn more. So stay tuned. I'm confident.
So, any information on English, Irish, or Scottish Delftware by them?
Ooh, great question. Oh, sorry. I got carried away. A great question. Someone has asked about, do we know anything about female involvement in English or Irish Delft? That is a very good question. I would assume, and it's also a wonderful subject in itself, because of course, there were many Dutch potters that moved to England and to the islands and started Delft potteries there. And so you have this spreading of Delft. So now, which is a subject in itself, or English Delft, as opposed to Dutch Delft. But I think that's a wonderful subject that that would be that for more research. Thank you. Oh, and happy to answer any any questions. I think there were so many. I'm trying to think of questions that some of my favorite questions. Well, I think let's see, some of the other women that were truly remarkable. I think there was Barbara Rodeville, who there's a wonderful chapter called The Thunderclap. And the Thunderclap chapter is about Barbara Rodeville, who founded her own pottery in 1671. And she grew up only a few blocks away from Johannes Vermeer, and they were about 5 years apart. And what's truly remarkable about Barbara is that Vermeer was the head of the Guild of St. Luke when she joined. So I can just imagine the meetings at the Guild. It would have been a spectacular time. I think another great question is often like where are some wonderful collections to see in general in the United States or abroad? I mean, of course, Amsterdam, but The Hague has a fantastic collection, decorative art collection at the Kunstmuseum in The Hague, which is phenomenal. And I think more and more people are actually visiting the Netherlands now more than ever. And I can't recommend more visiting Het Loo, which was William and Mary's, one of their summer, they had many residences in what was the Dutch Republic. But Het Loo is a gorgeous summer palace, and it has been restored, and its gardens are phenomenal. And it also has a lovely collection of Delftware. And then also in the United States, there are some wonderful, I mean, even here, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has one of the tiles from Mary's water gallery, if you can believe it. But it's all around us, and it's a great opportunity for adventure.
So how was Queen Mary's collection dispersed after her death? Was it destroyed?
So Queen Mary's collection, it's very interesting. It's what happened. It was when William, like shortly after her death, William decided that he wanted a clear view from Hampton Court Palace all the way to the Thames. So what probably started is they started packing up a lot of her, both her Chinese porcelain as well as her Delftware. Some pieces, a small portion are remained at Hampton Court Palace, and you can see those beautiful tulip ears. The rest, William, a huge portion of her collection to his sort of most intimate friends. And there's a great history and another stories of the Chinese porcelain that he sent back to the Dutch Republic, to one of his favorites, which was then completely lost and then dispersed within collections. The tiles were from the water gallery, were pried from the walls. And I think what's fantastic is that if you see the tile, Mary's tile that's at the Metropolitan Museum, you can see a slight little crack, like chip crack where they wedged it from the wall. And so I think they initially stored pieces and then the disbursements began, but only a small selection, only a few pieces remain, and what must have been hundreds of pieces originally in her collection. But great question.
I also have a question, actually, from me.
Thanks, Margaret.
Was there any Delftware production in New Amsterdam?
Ooh, well, you know what? That is a great question. I would assume, well, it's interesting because Adrian van der Donk, who owned this property, and his book that he published, he wrote a wonderful treatise on, and he noticed that we had the clay. And so he wrote, it's actually in the book, it's his brief synopsis on the quality of clay here in the Americas, and how wouldn't it be wonderful if people came here. He was suggesting that more Dutch citizens who'd come here start potteries to make everything, and he articulates it. He's like, we could make everything from pipes to bowls and dishes to bricks, and then he describes the quality of the clay. But I do not know the identity of any of but that's a great question. Maybe there are others that know. I'd love to learn more about American Delft.
I also have one more question for
Yes, ma'am.
So I've noticed that on the Delft tiles,
yes,
the images are a lot of religious imagery, but a lot of them are kind of cheeky too.
Oh my, it's so much fun. Absolutely.
So if you could speak a little bit on, I think, the sort of insertions of Dutch humor that you'll sometimes find in Delft.
Oh my gosh.
I find that really interesting.
That's a great, so so a lot of the, so as you know, as you mentioned, Margaret's asking about the history of, or the, you know, the iconography of the tiles, and they really vary, right, from religious, you know, for used for as sort of teaching tools for children and families, and then others are. There was a very popular engraving in the 17th century that depicted children playing all sorts of games, and a number of those figures were then used in the tiles. So they're like little individual figures from this famous engraving. And so, but it was, you know, they have a sense of humor. I mean, and it's they're fantastic. I love, so it really, yeah, it's everything from, you know, like children on stilts to, you know, wrestling, but it was a very popular print. And so I think it's an example, when you see those figures, it's a great example of the power of engraving in prints and their widespread use and the disbursement of different, you know, imagery, you know, spanning from, you know, the publishing world into the decorative arts. So I think it's a great example of that.
Yeah, and one more question from me.
Sure.
And we'll wrap up soon. If anybody else has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I was wondering as well, your book, it seems to be the first time that I've seen the sort of women's history coming out. And it reminds me a little bit of sort of when everybody figured out that Clara Skull was behind all the Tiffany art, etc., right? How did you sort of come about writing this book? And what was your sort of spark that made you want to go ahead and write a book on this subject?
It's really interesting because I really believe in serendipity. And so I was approached to write the book by someone who heard the woman who became my agent actually heard me speak on on the Delftware collection. I was asked to give a talk by the colonial dames on the collection, and what I found, and in my research, was revealing in that as what I went into was really a talk about the beauty of the objects. But in preparing that talk, what I realized is that the history of the women was just as impressive and almost even more interesting. So I think clearly I was drawn, it sort of organically, I was organically drawn to that, and the story just presented itself. So yeah, so I was approached to write this book after that lecture. And so, yeah, it's an honor to tell the story. Wow.
Somebody'd like to know if earthenware made outside of Delft, can you call itself Delft? An interesting question.
So I think, well, all right, because it's spelled like English Delft, so it's so very funny because what you'll see is they'll often use lowercase d instead of capital D, but we're splitting hairs. Also, when you get into territory, when you had Dutch potters moving to England, so it's a very like convoluted. But often you'll see in cataloging, whether it's in auctions or in museums, it'll go lowercase d, or they'll refer to it lower as opposed to uppercase d. But I think in general, yeah, but each tradition is so vibrant. I think each collecting group of enthusiasts have, so I would never say one is, necessarily, one or the other, but I think it is interesting how terminology evolves, and I loved writing this book, diving into the definition of words and the history of definitions of ceramic words, like the word China.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all exactly when a word starts the thing, and then it kind of it reflects like a global usage, and just that language is language, like the decorative arts, is constantly evolving. So I think that's a great question.
One final comment that they have the book. It's lovely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Great presentation, which I will have
Thank
to
you.
agree with.
Thank you.
Well,
It's my pleasure, and I hope to continue the conversation.
Well, I think that we will say goodnight for the evening, but I just want to once again thank Genevieve for a fantastic presentation, and we thank
Thanks,
all of
Margaret.
you this evening for joining us live from the West Parlor. If you have any
It's amazing.
questions that we didn't answer in the Q&A, you can feel free to email me. My name is Margaret, MARGARET, at VCHM.org is my email. And we hope that you come to the Van Cortlandt House to see not only the Delft collection, but also buy signed copies of Genevieve's book, which will be available after October the 1st. We thank you all so very much and hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you. Take care, all.